So welcome to our webinar today on a new paper that we have just published on where we stand in terms of let's say the stringency of environmental policies, or in more non-technical words, we are basically looking at where countries stand in terms of their environmental policies, climate policies. Of course, we know in the EU, in order to reach the goal to move towards net zero emissions by mid-century, we essentially need a tripling of emissions reductions from what we've seen over the last 2 decades. So it's important to take stock of where we stand, look at how things work and could be effective. And this is what my colleague Erik Frohm is going to present. And after that, I have a mix of climate policy experts from Germany and the Czech Republic and Poland, so we can basically discuss what that all means for countries in the region. So I have Jakub Sokolowski from the Institute of Structural Research will join us for the discussion later. Milan, I hope I pronounce it right, Ščasný from the Charles University Environment Center in Prague will be with us. Nils Meyer-Ohlendorf just joined. He's from the Ecologic Institute here in Berlin. And we also have Felix Chinuit, and he's from Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. I haven't practiced what it means, but another think tank here in Berlin. So they will join us after Erik's presentation. And Erik, without further ado, I give you the screen and the floor. We are very curious to learn what you have to present today.
Okay, thank you very much. So since it's Friday the 13th, I need to confirm that everything is working. So you can see my presentation, I hope, and you can hear me well. Great. So first of all, thank you very much, Nicola and the Berlin Center for inviting me here to, let's say, kick off this discussion today. I'm looking very much forward to it. So what I will present today is a project that has been ongoing at the OECD for a time, where we want to look at the effect of environmental policies in the broadest sense on CO2 emission. And we want to focus on cross-country comparison and sectoral comparisons to the full extent. So this is joint with work between several people in the economics department. So Filippo de Arcangelo, Tobias Kruse, Mauro Piso, and Orban Sila. So just to, let's say, summarize the paper so I really get the message through here. Well, what we really thought when we started this project is that there's a lot of evidence on climate policies at the country level, a lot of detailed modeling of how different emission reduction trajectories look like in climate models and so forth. There's quite limited empirical evidence at the cross-country level. So when we look at, when we can compare countries with the same kind of baseline methodology. So this is what we aim to do when we do in this paper. We estimate the effect on environmental policies in a very broad sense on CO2 emissions. So at the core of this analysis is the OECD's Environmental Policy Stringency Index. I will talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. I promise not to be too technical in this presentation already, so I'm going to be quite, let's say, liberal with how I talk about things, with keeping, let's say, to the more core parts of the project. So we have many countries in the sample. So we look at 30 OECD countries and 52 economic sectors. And their results are pretty, maybe unsurprising. If you increase the environmental policy stringency, emissions fall. What we find nicely in this paper is that sectors that are very fossil fuel intensive are the ones that actually reduce emissions, whereas those that are not fossil fuel intensive actually don't reduce their emissions by a lot. Then I will try to show a little bit how we can use this for more illustrative comparisons across countries, but also within the country, focusing a little bit on the Czech Republic. So the OECD's Environmental Policy Stringency Indicator, this is an attempt to get a comprehensive view of environmental policies in the broad sense. So what's nice about the EPS is that we can look at many countries, and we can see, how are countries comparing on this metric in terms of climate, energy, and air pollution policies. It ranges from 0 to 6. So 0 is the least stringent policy, to 6, the most stringent. So if we think of a carbon tax, for example, if you have 0 carbon price in your economy, you would score 0 on this indicator. Whereas if you have a very, very high price per ton, you would probably be in the 6. So we cover 13 instruments in this indicator. This might sound small or little, depending on how you see it, but it's because we want to have a very broad country perspective. So we want to cover many countries as possible over as long a period as possible. So the construction is a little bit, it takes into account these things that we want to have as many countries as possible, and then you can have all different policies. So it's based on 3 different sub-indices. So we have market-based policies as 1/3 of the index. That's what you would expect: CO2 taxes, cap and trade schemes, things like that. Things that put explicitly or implicitly a price on emissions. We have non-market policies, standards, regulations, so forth. And then we have technology support, so incentives for adoption for renewable technologies or R&D. So that's the EPS, and this is how the EPS looks for the OECD countries in our sample. So whenever I present slides here, I will always have the CEE countries in our sample to the left, and then the rest of the OECD countries to the right. What you see in this figure is that the red diamonds is the situation in the 2000s, so 20 years ago, more or less. And the blue bars is the situation in 2020. So all countries in the OECD actually improved or made their environmental policies more stringent. So we have had a push and good, let's say, development in environmental policies seen over this time period. There has been an increase. Okay, so I said I was not going to be very technical, but I need to explain a little bit what we do in this paper. So what we do is to relate environmental policy stringency, that's the EPS in this notation, to CO2 emissions. And the summation sign next to the EPS just means that we look at contemporaneous impacts, but also up to 10 years. So we can accumulate and look at the EPS, how it affects you today, but also 10 years in the future. And I think what's, let's say, a little bit innovative in this paper is that we also let sectors be differentially impacted by the EPS by including S in the second expression that you see on the screen. And S is the average share of fossil fuels in a sector's energy use. And fossil fuels here are coal, fuel oil, gasoline, diesel, natural gas, other types of gases and petrols. So this is the main equation that we estimate, and we have many controls, and we follow the literature on how do we include trends and so forth, and fixed effects. And important with these fixed effects, they mean that we, for identification, we look at country or sectors within countries over time. So we don't look for sectors between sectors or between countries. We really follow country sectors over time. And these year fixed effects, they control for international environmental agreements, global business cycles, and so forth, so that we can control for it. So when we estimate this regression, this is, let's say, one of the key results on the paper. So what I show in this figure is the 10-year impact on CO2 emissions, so the impact after 10 years, of 1 unit change in the EPS. So what we see is what I said initially: sectors with very low fossil fuel intensity barely reduce their emissions, whereas sectors with the medium fossil fuel intensity, they decrease their emissions by roughly 12%. And sectors with the very highest emissions intensity increase it or decrease it by a lot. So the background for this graph is in the paper that will be published, I think, in the coming weeks at the OECD website as a working paper. So you might think, okay, what are the industries that have a low fossil fuel intensity? On average, it's mainly services that are have very little fossil fuel intensity, whereas road transport, water transport, manufacturing, heavy manufacturing is mainly in sectors with the highest fossil fuel intensities. So the initial part of the project is just to estimate this relationship, and we try to run a bunch of robustness checks to make sure that the results are actually correct and not dependent on many other things. Again, I'll refer you to the paper or to my background slides that I could show what we do to try to robustify these results. But then in the second part, we want to know, well, how can we use these empirical results to compare countries along different dimensions? So one thing that we do is that we do an illustrative simulation, we call it that. It's a very, let's say, illustrative quantification. So we look at what would happen if OECD countries would all move today to the highest EPS performer. In the sample here, it's France in 2020. And again, you see the CEE countries on the left-hand side of the chart, where Poland has the least way to go to the France EPS, whereas Slovakia has the highest. And then we really just aggregate the results by the sector's fossil fuel shares or intensities. We look at each sector's share in CO2 emissions at the national level. And this is, we then multiply it with the distance to the French EPS to get to the full quantification. So this is one of the key results of this exercise. Among the CEs, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland are estimated to reduce their emissions by 25% if they move to the French EPS. A little bit less in Hungary and Slovenia. For the CEs as a group, this is slightly more than the OECD average seen across the countries. But what's interesting really with our results is not just that we say, look, this is the impact that could follow if you raise your EPS, but we can also look at specific sectors or which sectors could contribute to the emissions reduction. So we see in Czech Republic, it's in the electricity and gas supply sector. Same seems to be the case in Poland, whereas in Slovakia, it's more manufacturing. And in fact, if we look across OECD countries, we see that it's a lot of, the energy sector is very important here, but also manufacturing in some countries and transport in specific countries with very large transport sectors. So we can look at it from the sectoral perspective, but we can also look at it from the fossil fuel perspective. So each fossil fuel individually, since we know which fossil fuels these sectors use. So in Czech Republic, again, we see it's coal that could contribute to the emissions reduction. So substitute away from coal, get a little bit of an emissions reduction. Same again in Poland. Slovakia, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more mixed between natural gas, coal. And if you look again at the OECD more as a group, we see that it's natural gas, coal, and in some extent fuel oil in transport heavy countries. So this is what I mean with that we can compare countries when we do these illustrative scenarios. So for a specific country, we can also put these two things together. So again, now I focus on the Czech Republic because we just did a special chapter towards net zero in the Czech Republic in 2023. I advise you to read that chapter. But what we can do with this type of analysis is to look at, okay, we know which sectors that could contribute to the emissions, but we can also look at which fossil fuels they use. So again, then we see that, okay, the fossil fuel or the emissions reductions can be done in electricity and gas in the supply sector by using less coal. So for them, it's coal. It's the same in basic metals in Czech Republic, in mining and quarrying. But whereas, for example, in road transport, it's more about reducing diesel use. And along other sectors, that has more to do with natural gas. And then on the right-hand side, you see, let's say, the aggregation of all these for the country as a whole. So we see that coal really plays a big role in this country. So this can also help, countries think about, which are the sectors that will be impacted. If there's employment impacts, where should we should put efforts. So it can be used in different ways. So I just want to say this is not this type of methodology is not in contrast to other types of methods to look at the environmental problem and the economic effects. Climate modeling is very much used, but we see this as a useful complement to other types of analyses, and perhaps benchmarking, and to do a little bit more country-specific policy analysis. But it's definitely not a substitute. You need to do all kinds of things. You need to have climate modeling, other empirical methods for different questions, but we see it as a nice complement. So yes, the key takeaways from this talk is that we know that increasing the stringency in environmental policies will lower CO2 emissions. We can see from our paper that it increases with the sector's fossil fuel intensity. And we believe this data is pretty rich. We cover many countries, sectors, and a decent amount of fossil fuels. So we can get a pretty good picture on what's going on. And we can use this post-estimation analysis to talk to, you know, what happens if we increase, for example, carbon prices in Czech Republic. How would that translate into the EPS, and how would then the EPS impact emissions? So there's a mapping from policy choices into emission reductions. Yes, I think I will stop there, and thank you so much for listening, and I'm really happy to hear the rest of the discussion going forward. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So, Erik, so for this new analytical tool in some ways to compare countries on where they stand, can you take down the slides? Right? Yeah, perfect. And I think it's a good start into our discussions. Perhaps I would start with Milan, because you said, Milan, you just finished some piece of modeling, I assume for the Czech Republic. So what we saw that the distance to the frontier, so to speak, is quite big in the Czech Republic, and it's mostly related to coal and to few energy intensive sectors. So it looks like, just on paper, it looks like there's a lot of potential, but on the other hand, all these implementing these policies can be politically very contentious. It has competitiveness implications. It has can have implications on employment and also social implications. So perhaps you can give us some background how this work would be received in the Czech Republic. Is it useful, and can you build on that in order to promote further policy steps towards net zero?
Okay, thank you, Nicola, and thank you to Erik. It's a very, very interesting paper, and in comment, maybe I can just send you my technical comment later on. So you presented for the Czech Republic, there is a potential to reduce emissions, carbon emissions by 25%. So to be honest, if we keep going with current regulation, I'm not so optimistic. We just compared rates with external costs like 10 years ago, and the title of the paper is Much Ado About Nothing. So, so basically, emissions are more or less stable. They are driven by GDP growth. Emissions in transportations are growing and not declining. And of course, there are some changes, especially in power sector. That's true. But when I compared your results with my results, they are quite similar. We use completely different methodology. We use TIMES, that is an energy system optimization model, linked with ECME, that it's a global macroeconometric model. And actually, we are reducing, or we are achieving 55 targets by 2030 in the Czech Republic, but this is mainly driven by ETS and then by ETS2. And if you look at the results, mainly or mostly carbon emissions are reduced in ETS1 sector and heavily by in energy sector, by power and heat. You know, when ETS, when the market price of EUAs were about 20, it was not really effective. Nothing happened. But now with 80, 90 euro per ton, brown coal is not competitive. So in our model, in our scenarios, we had a coal phase out by 2033. But brown coal is leaving the system much earlier, because you need to have a spread, I think, like 30-40 euros between the market price and the market price of emission allowances. And even now the spread is much lower. So basically it's very difficult to even cover operational profit. So looking at the heat and cogeneration, that is very typical for our region. So they will be phased out much earlier, I think, if there is no like public support just to compensate or mitigate social impacts, because heat or central heat or district heating is mainly supplying energy to multi-family apartment buildings where, let's say, first deciles are living in cities. So there is now really discussion how to transform heat sector. But as I said, if we trust our modeling, neglecting social impacts, emissions are going down from, I think, 70 to 40 megatons in power sector in ETS1. In industry, it's going slightly down, and even then it's going up, because we expect increase in GDP compared to 2020. In transportation, it's more or less the same. If you look at ECR, effort sharing regulation, emissions are more or less the same. We assume EWA of ETS2 from 2027, but still it's not very effective at the beginning of the period because of also this price ceiling. We know that the Commission might intervene if price exceeds 45 euro. So this is a problem. It's basically going up. The strongest effect was really Russian attack of Ukraine, because the price of diesel and gasoline increased by 60% in a minute. So we had 300 battery electric vehicles registered annually in the past. Now we have 500 monthly. So this was not driven by regulation, stringent or not stringent, but international prices or international market. So my conclusion is that this is a nice exercise, but basically it looks back when the regulation was not stringent, even if you saw 1 or 1.5 point increase during 20 years. So when we model business as usual with the ETS price about 70 euro up to 2040, emissions are reduced only 10%. Okay. This price coming from harmonized cost trajectories by European Commission that reaches converge, price is converging to 400, then we are achieving 90% reduction by 2050, not 100. Marginal emissions are extremely expensive. So I think I'm going to stop here because I'm not here alone, but it's nice work and it's comparable results, but they're achieved or reached by different methodology. But thank you.
Thanks, Milan. But if I understand Milan correctly, so basically what you're saying, Milan, is if the ETS, the European emissions trading system, bites, that could basically more or less do the trick. There's not so much policies in country-specific policies that are even needed. I hope I understood that correctly. No,
by 2030, it's the most effective because it's not only ETS, but the ETS has also second side, revenues, and how these revenues will be recycled back through modernization fund, innovation fund, and social climate fund. So I think it's quite clear how it will be used, the revenues coming to modernization fund and from auctions to support the renewable resources and so on and so forth. Now there's a discussion how to use basically funds or revenues from social climate funds to basically boost energy efficiency in buildings where low-income households are living, or even to provide lump sum social compensations to like first, second, third income deciles. So there are two sides, it's not only pricing, but how these billions will be recycled back to support which technologies. And of course, when we run our models, then we see that GDP will be boosted because it's positive investment shock, but also employment will be increased. That's good, but it's also bad because mainly employment will be increased in construction sector. And even now, we are short. There are no people to build houses or to insulate houses. Mm-hmm. So now you expose economy to new shock, so providing, this investment. And now we should really open discussions and how to basically, do other policies, not only ETS linked, that will help to use / efficiently use these revenues. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Milan. And perhaps Nils, you joined in very spontaneously, but you're an EU climate policies expert, and I think it would be interesting to hear from you. So Milan basically says, at least according to his models, that, I mean, the pricing system within the EU would really be key. You just explained not only, of course, the taxing, the prices, but also how you use them. Of course, here in Germany, a lot of national flanking policies are underway. Milan mentioned the heating part, that's very relevant here as well. But of course, also just, developing, promoting renewables and the electrification through strengthening the network, the transmission network. All of these things are, of course, happening at the national level. And in a model, you could think of them as being a reaction to a price, a European-wide price. But what I would like to hear from you, how important is it to promote further the EU instruments, the EU-level instruments, and how important is it that member countries complement this with their own strategies to really move into the right direction?
No, thanks, Nicola. Yeah, also, I mean, thanks for the invitation, but I must say, I didn't realize that this would be an all-male panel. Actually, we have a policy at Ecologic where we don't attend such panels, but well, this is how it is now. But anyways, thanks very much. I think, yeah, on your question, yeah, I mean, I think the discussion somewhat has moved beyond that. I mean, carbon pricing plays a role, that's true. But I mean, you cannot do the trick only with carbon pricing. I mean, if you try to do that, you look at prices that are, yeah, clearly, I mean, too high to be socially viable. So, and I think we have seen it in the past. I mean, we have seen it last year when, I mean, energy prices skyrocketed, and the first reaction was, I mean, to postpone price increases that we had in the ETS, in the national emission trading scheme. So I think that is, it's important element, but it's, I think, a bit of textbook logic to believe that this will do the trick, because I mean we have to decarbonize the economy throughout. I mean, we have to reduce all emissions, and that includes also those that are actually very small. So, what kind of emission price would you need to phase out? I mean, for example, standby modes at your stereo, for example, or at your TV set. No, I mean, that kind of demand is also there, and it requires more than a carbon price. It requires regulation. And I think if you look at household appliances and Eco Design Directive, it has worked quite well, where we decrease energy demand without really relying on the carbon price. So, I mein, just one comment on Erik. I mean, thanks very much. I think it was a very good presentation. I must say, I struggle a bit with the EPS index. I mean, I wonder, how you actually compile this. I mean, to what extent these 13 indexes, I mean, I understand the 13 indicators that make up this EPS, to what extent this actually reflects reality. I think Milan also mentioned this to some extent already. And we have so many other policies that are not regulation that might drive emissions a lot more. I mean, if I look at transport, I would say, yes, emission values in cars is an important element, and carbon pricing is an important element, but city designs are also an important element, and model split. So I think, how do you reflect that? And so I think it just, I think that's the challenge. I mean, it comes across as it's something very objective and just like, telling you, I mean, what is actually happening. But I would say it is really scratching the surface, and it needs to go to the details. I mean, that is, I think, very complex. I think it's not possible with such indicator or an index, in particular, if you cover all OECD countries. I think, I mean, that is probably an exercise that tells us something, but if you really want to go to the details, it makes a difference. Maybe that system is not the right component. Yeah, I think, and just I mean, for example, when you talk about market instruments and non-market instruments, I was wondering, I mean, is ETS a market instrument? I would say most people would say yes, it is a market instrument. I mean, almost goes without saying for most people, but if you look at the regulation itself, it has a very strong demand and control element. It tells companies you cannot emit more than this, and that is, I mean, that is regulation. So, I mean, I would say maybe it is an interesting exercise, but I mean, is it really capturing the details? I would say details matter. And to what extent does it really help to influence policy making? Is it really something that helps to drive the discussion, or is it something that is conveying a truth that might be a bit too much scratching the surface?
Nicola, could I respond to
you?
Both
of course you should, but I have to respond too, Nils. You can tell your so I'm very so first of all, we'd contacted many female climate policy experts, and we didn't want to cancel just because for only men were able to come this time. But I have a clear conscience because we average our gender balance over at least a week, and we had a all-female panel on antimicrobial resistance on Tuesday and a balanced panel on employment yesterday. So I hope you can report that back to Ecologic. Sorry, Erik, but yes, it's more important now to talk about the EPS indicator and how it's how to read it, because the instruments for sure are very different that are being lumped together in an index, right? So Erik, please.
Right. So I'll start with Nils' comment on the EPS. Yes, it's not a full, let's say, comprehensive in the sense that it captures everything that it affects the environment or emissions in general. It's quite a narrow instrument, like you saw, 13 instruments. You mentioned that yourself. Investments in infrastructure and that stuff also affects, of course, transport emissions, the availability to decarbonize road transport. So how we see the EPS is as one composite indicator where we can get some kind of view where countries stand relative to each other. But then what we do when we write our country surveys, for example, so I work in the country studies branch. So when we look at Czech Republic, we use the EPS as one input to the analysis, but we also use climatic analysis similar to what Milan was talking about. And we also analyze very specifically structural impediments. And this goes to Milan's question of recycling revenues back into environmentally better, let's say, retrofitting of buildings, strengthening incentives. There's a lot that countries can do to, in Czech Republic, for example, permitting processes for new construction takes quite a while to get. There's a lot of red tape surrounding new construction and building electrical poles, for example, in a transport network. So in our country surveys, we are able to go a little bit more into detail, like what you're alluding to, than to just look at one overarching indicator. So I think it's a good first step to get a sense, and then we drill down into specific countries and really try to figure out the right policies, the combination of policies, employment impact, competitiveness impacts, and so forth. So, thank you.
It was really to show the starting point a little bit, and it's true. It's important then to discuss does it really reflect what countries are doing, but we thought it's a nice starting point to see where we stand and where we could go. Felix, you're also an expert on European climate policies, and perhaps because Erik just mentioned it, so one thing is what you could achieve in a model, if you strengthened climate policies further. But another dimension is where are you getting there and what are the impediments? So to you, do you think the European emissions trading system, but also Fit for 55, the entire package, are we on the right track? Are we getting there? And what are the biggest impediments to making more progress?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Maybe let me start with a reflection on the work from Erik, because I think given the structure of the Paris Agreement, this kind of work, this comparative work is very important because we need to understand what is going on the ground in countries. And for large N comparisons, this is very important material also for our research. So these indicators are important. And then I completely agree what Erik also just said, that we sort of need to complement this kind of analysis then with more maybe qualitative policy analysis or whatever you want to call it. So I think we need to also consider the politics of climate policy making when doing this kind of analysis, especially when we also talk about alliances in the European Union, anticipating what is coming next. We need to think about politics as well. And maybe especially when we talk about net zero and this fact that we now also talk about the uncomfortable emissions. So we haven't talked about industrial emissions for quite some time, and also agriculture emissions, because we didn't really have a zero or net zero target. Now we have the net zero target, and we need to talk about the nexus between climate policy and industrial policy and climate policy. And I think that will also be the next challenge at EU level and for the next Commission after European elections, to identify ways of, how are these policy links, and that could also be a challenge for these kind of indicators, because it's not only environmental policy that is then relevant, but also industrial policy, for example. On the Fit for 55, I think I'd like to say that I'm personally quite surprised that the European Union managed to get it done and finish the files in time with ambitious targets. I mean, even with regulatory innovations like the ETS2, we've heard about that, but also CBAM. And I anticipate in the coming years quite some efforts in climate backsliding within the European Union, not only in the European Union, but there will be countries that engage in reducing the ambition in climate policy. And I think we will look back and ask, well, how was it possible to agree on Fit for 55 during a pandemic and a war? So I think it's good that we have agreed on it, and we now need to secure the political support for the instruments that we adopted there. So we still need to implement ETS2 and CBAM, etc. So I think this is a big challenge to deliver on what we agreed on in Fit for 55 and implement in member states, of course, as well. Maybe I stop here for now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Felix talked about the politics of it and what we saw, and of course it's all very illustrative, but what I saw in the slides that Erik showed, that at least for the Czech Republic and Poland, and also Germany, by the way, reducing coal emissions has a lot of potential. Well, in Germany, there's already an agreement or a political decision to phase out coal. But in other countries, including Poland, it's much more difficult, contentious, etc. There's a lot of tradition behind it. And you, Jakob, you don't look into this, but you do look into the social dimension, right, of making further progress. And yeah, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that in order to achieve, because actually, well, we're just looking at sub-indicators, but in order to actually implement these policies, there's a lot going on for countries, politically, socially, in terms of competitiveness. So it would be great to hear your take on that.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Erik, for the very interesting paper. I read it and I found it very well structured and very well written and very interesting. What I think is important, and what is my suggestion in terms of the policy process, is actually to start with the social impacts and the distributional impacts, and then go to the emissions. Because I think that in Central Eastern European countries, we already know that more stringency will bring more emission reduction. So I don't think that this is a message that's going to be, let's say, debatable. people already understood it, but knowing the policy process, and we also do some research on mining and phasing out coal mining and the impacts on labor market. But this is what we usually do when we want to convince policymakers for more stringent emission policies. We say that there will be social impacts, there will be distributional impacts, but we show them ways to tackle it. So this is, of course, very, let's say, specific environment that we have in Poland. We have a lot of coal in our energy mix. So we know that we need to decarbonize it. There are more and less ambitious targets depending on the government and the particular ministries that are involved in this process. But what I would like also to stress out is that we have to consider the preferences of people for redistribution. And this is something that we started to do here in Poland, and we want to extend it, because from the macro perspective, even from, let's say, going from macro perspective to distributional perspective and doing micro simulation to show impacts in terms of welfare on household, we will usually see that investment combined with some lump sum transfer, as Milan was also mentioning, will help us to secure that there are not so many welfare losses in people with among people with low incomes, let's say this first deciles. But what we haven't been considering, and what we have observed in the Yellow Vest movement, for example, in France, that those kind of arguments not necessarily reach people. I mean, the households and then the policymakers. And we, by the way, we have election in a couple of days in Poland, and the climate policy is one of very important elements of this election. So we started wondering, how can we include the social preferences in the redistribution policies? And we started doing quantitative exercises. And what we learned is that there are very important and significant differences in the preferences on how the money from Social Climate Fund, for example, should be redistributed. So we know that in terms of macro and microeconomic efficiency, a complementary mix between investment support and lump sum transfer would probably be preferable, or even we could just spend from macro perspective everything on investment, probably to get the most benefits. But we know that there are a lot of differences between people with low incomes on how they would like to have the money from the revenues from ETS2 be redistributed to them. And we know that they prefer lump sum transfers. So this is maybe a way to add, I don't want to be the person that only says we have to add more complexity to our analysis. But I would suggest that this is a good way of thinking, that we already, I think this is not up to debate anymore, that more stringency will bring, because nobody will do it on their own. We already saw that 20 years back, or even if we look at the 10 years back, that these emissions won't come just voluntarily. Unfortunately, we would like to see it, but it's very difficult to achieve. And with energy crisis, I think that it's good to maybe consider another narrative, and what we see in Central Eastern European countries, that the energy security narrative is working. So we try to present to policymakers that stringent emission policies are a way to decrease the dependence on imports of fossil fuels from Russia. So this is an argumentation that helps for policymakers. But for households, I think that adding another complex but possible perspective is to work on how the money should be redistributed, because it will give us a good policy mix. And we will have to debate, as Milan is already saying, that they are discussing the climate and energy plan for Czech Republic. But next year, we will have to discuss the social climate plan for our countries. So there will be another question on how much we should give and to whom we should redistribute the money and in what form. So my proposition is to be prepared. We are trying to do those exercises in Central Eastern European countries. We did this, let's say, classic distributional effects even for Germany, because Germany was included in our analysis. So I completely agree with your outcomes, and I think that they are very robust, and we get very similar results from a different model that we are using. But I think that we should broaden our perspective, and this also is possible in quantitative analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, I see raised hands, and Erik, you raised it first. Then Nils, I think Jakub made important points. I have, so of course, Erik, you wanted to react to something, but help me here. I think we have work also on the acceptance of climate policy instruments at the OECD, and I think actually, or even in Germany, so what you outlined, so the lump sum transfer, if you model it, it's great. It's redistributive and everything. It's effective. It doesn't on first impact you wouldn't think it's progressive, but indeed it is. But it's also not very popular, I think. But maybe I'm mistaken, and Erik, I don't know whether you can help me here, but do make your comment, of course, as well.
No, so my reaction is addressing both Felix and Jakub. So like you said, Nicola, we have actually, as an institution, worked a little bit on the acceptability of climate policy. So we came out with a paper together with external researchers last year that looked at, asked, it was a survey-based, let's say, analysis where we asked people in different countries, what do you think of carbon prices? What's the acceptability for that vis-a-vis subsidies? And if you combine a carbon price with social transfers, would it be more acceptable, et cetera, et cetera? There was many variations of this. And I think this paper is quite good to get an understanding of, let's say, the political acceptability of climate policies vis-a-vis each other, and can be used a little bit as a starting point to start analyzing these questions. So from that, you see that carbon prices have much higher acceptability, if you funnel money back into, retrofitting, for example, or as transfers to poor households, or even lowering wages. So that's a nice paper to start off that kind of analysis on. And I do think the OECD has worked quite a lot on, let's say, the employment impacts and distributional impacts on environmental policies. We did not do that in this paper because we actually saw that we are doing a lot, and there's more work forthcoming. But I agree, it's a very important issue, and like we shouldn't forget the distributional questions or the societal implications, because it's key for any kind of political acceptance. So thank you.
Nils, you had the second hand that was raised.
No, thanks, Nicola. I think on the point that Felix raised on comparing countries, I mean, that is, of course, embedded in the Paris Agreement, the whole structure. And I think that's a very important component of the whole discussion. I think it is, there's like a better way to align that comparison to what is actually happening on the ground. And that is, if you look at specific sectors, and if you look at, what is actually happening in these sectors in more detail. So, for example, if you look at transport, you would have to look at the number of electric vehicles. You would also look at the number of, car-free zones in cities, to what extent countries actually expand their road infrastructure, to what extent they build new railways, and to what extent they actually scale down aviation. These are interesting questions. So I think if you look at the sector approach, you could also do the same for agriculture. What is the number of livestock in a country? Is it reducing? Is it increasing? If you have that, I think you have a better understanding to what extent specific countries move toward climate neutrality. So I think it's also much closer aligned to the discourse. And there is some work on that. It's the Climate Neutrality Observatory. It's partly done by a pretty large consortium. I can share the link in a moment. I think that is, it avoids the step of the EPS, which is pretty hard to approach if you are not within that circle. If you're a policymaker, I think it's more telling if you look at specific developments in specific sectors and instruments. And I share the link here with just a second. Yeah.
That's great. And I should tell because usually we have a lot of discussion in the chat or people sharing work, etc. So not only the panel, the audience, or you can ask questions and we can feed it into the discussion. So please do that. But Milan, you had a comment also.
Yeah, right. Thanks. I fully agree what Jakub said. You know, we run this pictures experiment, including in Poland, and we actually really found that the strongest opposition is really in Poland and Czech Republic. Of course, we identify cluster or classes of people who are supportive, mainly rich, educated, but then this group that is really against, with really negative implicit willingness to pay for this policy, whatever even recycling was very large in Poland and Czech Republic, like 30%. And then of course we can dig in what is the preference heterogeneity, we can analyze that. So we have data, we know about that. We also run both as microsimulation models, but these models always expect rationality, price elasticity, whatever. So we provide also these results coming from E3M, OECD, or microsimulation model. But always I am saying, guys, this is only if households will react. And there's a lot of to say problems like energy efficiency paradox and other stuff. We have in the Czech Republic the segment of tenants, it's quite large. There's classical problem, principal agent problem, or landlord tenant. There is no even incentive to insulate these houses. So basically, what I would like to say in general, that this policy should not make richer guys richer and poor guys poor, because the subsidy on battery electric cars, come on, typically taxes are regressive and subsidies are progressive. Okay, and we should think how to basically these mitigation measures should reduce regressivity of taxes and reduce progressivity of subsidies. So there are many studies, that the likelihood of beneficiaries of these public subsidies, even in Germany and other countries, are highest deciles. So this is really how to basically design this policy, because as I said, ETS will be now maybe the strongest, visible strongest instruments with 1,000 billion of revenues coming to Czech Republic in the next 7 years. It's 25% of GDP, annual GDP. It's a lot. But we are not ready, I think, for that to use it efficiently and effectively, right? And in a way that the adverse social effects will be reduced. Second point, I think governments should provide right signals. We have this war, Russian attack, prices went up. What happened? There was a price ceiling. And come on, it was a very great opportunity to really introduce or increase habits to save energy. What happened in the Czech Republic? In the first 3 months, consumption went down by 20-30%. And in February, after price ceiling, it went up even more than before. And this was not really a signal. Everybody was talking about Green Deal, about ETS, energy savings, and we are introducing price ceilings. Like ban on conventional vehicles. Yes, we will not be able maybe to register new vehicles from 2035. But there's nice studies from Switzerland. If you regulate only one segment, there will be adverse effect on the other segments. So basically in Switzerland, what happened, that the lifetime of second-hand cars was extended and emissions increased, not decreased. And so if we are talking about, a ban on newly registered new vehicles, we should also regulate these second-hand markets. And what also Felix and Nils said, I think everything is about infrastructures or structures. I think maybe some money rather than providing lump sum that will be just bring income effect. maybe we should really support infrastructure like public transport that should be maybe for free or provided, or talk about accessibility and other stuff. Flexibility in demand, you know, and nobody is really raising this issue that maybe electricity is a service, not only product. Why we are paying same euro per kilowatt hour in on peak and off peak hours. And it's the same about agriculture. Agriculture is now very small in terms of carbon emissions, less than 10%, but in 20 years, their share will be 30. The only strategy here that is proposing officially that carbon emissions should go up, it's agriculture policy. Nobody is talking about changing diets, and we know that changing diets like saving energy is long-term process. Sorry to talk too long.
No, very well. And I have Nils and Jakob's hand again, but I do want to ask Felix a question before that. But because this is a very important, these are, well, many points, a number of points, but the one on the distributional effects, how important do you think, do you agree with Jakob, also a little bit at the EU level, is this the key point? Should you ask first before you implement climate policy, what's the distributional effect? How acceptable is it going to be? Just to make sure that it's this introduction of the policy is sustainable and yeah, it will work in the long run. It would be curious to hear your take.
Yes, maybe one thought on that. I completely agree that it is a key dimension. It shouldn't be a straw man argument for not doing ambitious climate policy. I think it's also important to stress that because it is used sometimes as a straw man argument, and it shouldn't be used. But at the same time, it is very important to address it politically. And one example, I think, is if you look at how the effort sharing regulation, where the European Union regulated nationally binding targets for member states, the negotiations on these targets were really one of the most competed issues on regulating climate or addressing climate policy in the EU. And I think this shows that the comparison also between countries, who's doing how much, and like what are my neighboring countries doing, I think this is very important to find mechanisms to address this. And I think this is also, because we touched earlier the ETS, I think we will always have some kind of differentiation of ambition in European climate policy. I think this is something that will also be relevant in the coming years when we talk about the post-2030 governance architecture. And this is something where we should really invest some time in thinking about how to design that and how to address distribution effects across member states, because this will be a key source for like how countries ally together, how they group together. And I think this will be very interesting to see who groups, what kind of groups will emerge in the coming years there.
But in some ways, what you're saying, and I know that's often not politically feasible either, but it's almost better to have a comprehensive pan-European instrument like CO2 price, which would cover more or almost nearly every sector, in the sense that then you would really be efficient by reducing where it's least costly first, while when you start to say everybody has to negotiate who contributes what, then you very much get into this heckling, right? Is that a dimension to be considered? Felix? And the others, okay.
Yes, it is a dimension that should be considered. I think we would also need to talk about the implementation at member state level, because we also have problems of member stating just not implementing stuff. We earlier talked about the delay of national energy and climate plans. I think the deadline was in July or June, and I don't know if there are already half of them there. Also, Germany didn't submit their NECP yet. I think it's due in October now. So there is an implementation problem, and I think it's good to talk about instruments at the European level, but it's also good to zoom into countries and ask what are they actually doing about that. And in Germany, we sometimes forget how deeply integrated climate policy is in the European Union. So we already have quite some competencies at EU level, and that's sometimes forgotten in the German debate. Yeah.
Thank you. Nils, I think your hand came up first, and then there's Jakub.
No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Felix on negotiation of national target has been quite contentious, but I would disagree when it comes to saying this has been contentious throughout. It has been quite contentious in the first round. In the second round, it has actually been pretty, pretty smooth, relatively speaking. So I would say that this whole structure of national binding targets has been a very important pillar of the whole EU climate architecture, because it conveys a very clear message to countries, but in particular to people and voters, where this country has to go to. So if we have a system like now, climate neutrality by 2050 in Europe, it is a collective target for the EU as a whole. It is not a target for specific member states. And for voters, it's hard to understand what is actually the contribution of my country to that target. And it is a fact, I would say, that voters align much more to the national level than to the EU level. And if you want to have a democratic transition towards climate neutrality, national targets play an important role, because they allow voters to hold their government to account, and they also allow countries to own their own climate policies. I mean, they can design their climate policies within that framework of that target, but that target does not allow for a free ride for that country. So I think it's a nice way to align on to reconcile the tension on owning the agenda, decarbonization by countries, and being accountable. So I think for a democratic transition, national targets play an important role, and national accountability plays a role. And national targets have been the key instrument to have a visible accountability for countries, not only for specific instruments, but for the overall climate action as a whole. And one more comment on preventing yellow vests. I think that is not the point. It's not about preventing yellow vests. I think people have the right to take the street, and they have the right to put on yellow vests. I think it's the other way around. It's really about, avoiding social inequalities. That is the key point. That is a very important element of the whole discussion. We see it throughout. It's a key element of the whole debate, but it goes without saying. But it's not really about preventing people from taking the street. That is their right.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right, but the way I understood it was, well, I think in the run-up to that term unrest, let's say, was almost civil unrest. I think two things have been forgotten. One was right, the infrastructure. Do people have the possibility to be mobile still when CO2 prices rise that far? And also, I think the distributional element was not there, if I remember correctly. But please correct me if I'm wrong. Jakub, I also looked up what I said before about the climate bonus, the lump sum benefit not being very popular, and I think it plays into your hands because in the OECD survey, basically, so funding environmental infrastructure and subsidies to low carbon tech, quite popular in Germany and Poland. I don't see other countries here. Targeted transfers, quite popular, but the lump sum transfer really not popular. So that's interesting. But you had another comment, Jakub, and please.
Yes, I also I would also be happy to see people protesting the issues that they dislike. I am very for it. I support it, but I would not like to see people protesting climate policies. This is the only issue, and this is the relation that we were, or this is the connection to the Yellow Vest movement. So we would like to have climate policies with the distributional effects considered, with the social effects considered, to stop another protest against climate policies, because we would like to see ambitious climate policy targets, and just with the people on board and not people protesting them. So our idea to avoid those types of protest is to consider the social effects and consider the redistributional effects. About what I wanted to comment, there were the previous comments were about the perspective that European Union is taking, because you also asked if we can see if the perspective is changing. I think that we can actually see that, because we know that Social Climate Fund is going to come in force earlier than the ETS2. So we will have this 1 year. It was supposed to be 2 years, which I think was even a better idea. But now we are going to have 1 year that only there will be transfers coming to the countries before there will be the actual tax in place. So I think this is a signal, an important signal from the European Union, that the social and distributional effects are being considered and are being taken seriously. And just to finish about the lump sum and targeted support, I think that this is very intuitive result, and I think that even we were involved in a social panel about energy crisis in Poland, and we could also see that people, whenever they hear that it's going to be a lump sum transfer, they don't think that this is actually very effective or maybe socially just. But when they hear that it's going to be targeted, then the support is growing. But of course, this is something that requires also additional analysis, not only service or qualitative, let's say, discussions. Thank you.
It's the poll tax effect, right? That was similar. Felix, you had a comment probably to Nils.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on Nils, and I completely agree that national targets are important and will continue to be important, and also that the accountability is an important element. And one issue that will receive more attention, I think, is the timing of net zero of EU member states, because the net zero target we talked about at 2050, it's a union-wide target. So there is some differentiation possible, and there will be some kind of effort sharing, because we already have countries that have targets that are before 2050, and there are also countries who voice their interest in being later than 2050. And I think this question of what is the timing, and do we sort of regulate it at the European level, or how do we do that? I think that is one debate on effort sharing that we will have in the coming years.
Thank you, Felix. Actually, I want to cycle back to something Nils said earlier and put that question to you in some way, Erik. So Nils said it's better perhaps to look at instruments, if I understood you correctly, at the sectoral level, so you understand better what happens. What are the different uses for the index that you have, Erik? It seemed that you have broken it down by sectors, you have broken it down by fuels. Can you break it down by instruments? So what are the kind of things you can actually do with this indicator? Or is it more illustrative to say, well, this is broadly where we calculate that countries stand? That would be interesting to know.
Yeah, so first on the composition of the index, we can look at the differences, what comprises the index for each individual member, of course. In the paper, we try to distinguish, are market policies more effective than non-market-based or technologically support measures? And we find, at least in this analysis, it's hard to distinguish with the three of them. They're pretty similar, actually, which might be true or not, that we need to dig a little bit deeper into, let's say, specific policies. I think on the sectoral instruments, if I understand Nils more, it's, you can compare countries' emission trajectories for different sectors, for example, based on climate models. That's one way. But I would say, one thing that I think also Nils said, it's important to look at these other things that we don't capture with direct climate policy. So again, I think, at least from our perspective, the OECD, we focus a lot on other structural policies or impediments. Like Milan also said, it might be problematic, even if you have the money to actually spend it on, renovation programs, because take-up might be low for whatever reason. Maybe the subsidy programs are poorly designed, or it just doesn't reach out to people. And I think these kind of, let's say, more structural issues are quite important to actually both get buy-in from let's say the compensating policies, but also to make them actually effective. Because if you have very stringent construction regulation and you need to build a bunch of new solar panels, that's not going to happen even if you have the money, if it takes a long time. So that's going to delay that problem. So for sure, like again, the EPS and how we use it, we look at historical correlations. Milan talked about this too. It's a backward-looking analysis. So we look at how did environmental policy affect emissions during this time. So for projections, it's we don't call it projections when we do these scenarios. We call it like more illustrated quantifications, because it's obviously not a projection. It's a backward-looking thing. And future environmental policies might be more effective than past ones. They might be less effective too, because we have already, let's say, tackled the easier, let's say, the sectors that are less easy to reduce emissions to, like transport is could be quite difficult, for example. But no, I totally agree.
Thanks. Milan, I was going to ask you a question too, but I let you talk first.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Erik, what you said, I think this is interesting study and useful, but I would really use it for like retrospective analysis of backward, because on this the past systems were very different, and maybe it would be good to look at particular sectors, because like in transportation, maybe what is more important is not fuel tax, but maybe bonus malus or registration tax. With what durable or capital goods basically you are driving, because our needs are not saturated, especially in Central Europe. So whatever fuel cost is, maybe it's not really effective. And as you said, there are so many things. Like now, we have feed-in tariff for wind, but only 2 power wind towers were built in last 10 years, because the opposition of people, like NIMBY, it's so strong. And also bureaucratic system process, like it is again referring to Repower EU. It was so painful. So now we have discussions about completely another tools, like go-to zones, acceleration zones, where to build these and that technologies. And so far we only discussed the social impacts. I agree, it's really a problem. Still, we should keep going. But in the Czech Republic, there were another 2 issues that were heavily discussed, and both of them were related with system costs of electric or power system, because we will have subsidies coming from the EU from salt allowances. So there is a will to use them to support investment in photovoltaics and wind. But what about our grid? So maybe we have some estimates how to improve transmission lines, but it's more difficult with distribution lines. And so we were heavily criticized because we are using times, and we have only 12 time slices. Fortunately, we made collaboration with Czech TSO. They have Plexos, so they run model dispatch for every hour. But still, it's the same discussion like in Germany, because you have very good connection in west and east, but not between north and south, because historically it was different. So I think we should all open these issues, like storage. Is there a potential, to, because this voice is so strong, and it end that the costs will be of electricity and heat will be very high, and the electricity will not be here. And nobody is discussing about the demand side management or flexibility of demand, because mainly these critiques are coming from industry, and industry are engineers, or engineers are in the industry. So as Jakub said, I think it was you, at the very beginning, we should really talk about behavior responses. how to change behavior, because we are locked in, not only in terms of durables of capital stock, but also thinking of behaving, how to use infrastructure differently, how infrastructure should be looked like, or structures that we will be living, like, the sharing goods maybe, or this kind of stuff, or, to have very different pricing, very different tariff policy. So I think this is very important. And then you can introduce some components in this system, demand side management, that will be pro-social, as well. Thank you.
So basically what you're saying, Milan, is not only about the social effects, but also about breaking past behavior, or to say it more positively, showing new options and convincing people. And that's difficult because they are used to what they know, right?
Let me say it differently. I think 95% of discussion is about supply side, okay? About production, what technologies, how to use this money. And very little is discussed or talked about behavior, we can generate kilowatt hours and gigajoules somehow using these or that technologies. But at the end, we should really talk about energy services, not about energy demand. I mean, like demand on kilowatt hours, that is direct demand. So how to basically satisfy these needs, changing not only capital goods or durable goods, but also how we'll be using service flow coming from the durable goods.
Very interesting. And we can see we are past our time, but I think I want to use one more question. But what we can see, and one comment first, we can see that from an index, an OECD index, we can actually open up the entire complexity of climate policies. Jakub, I wanted to ask you about this, because of course you look a lot at the social dimension, the labor market dimension of climate policies. What do you think about this argument that Milan made, that sometimes the resistance can also come from the fact that people or companies, engineers, whoever, are used to something and cannot see how to do it differently? Is that something that needs to be addressed much more?
I agree. I agree with that, and I also agree with the need for right signaling. But the governments can do it with right signaling, and we observed it in Poland for, let's say, past 30 years in transition, when the households were asked to, let's say, modernize their homes, and there was no, let's say, no technology was excluded. Even from public funding, you could get subsidy for a coal stove. So we just saw households changing from a very outdated coal stove to a less outdated coal stove, because they were just optimizing their let's say bills and the way their behavior, which is pretty natural because this is what people do. But with the right signaling, and it can be done, for example, by technological exclusion of coal stoves, or by presenting, for example, right alternatives in the labor market. Because right now we are starting the discussion on the coal phase out by saying, okay, we are just closing down coal mines. But if we start the discussion with saying, okay, we are opening new industries and we already know what we want to do, then maybe the discussion is going to be a bit less complicated. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but this is what we should, let's say, expect. This is what we should expect from the government. And our government in the energy crisis was also giving coal allowance. And we know that this coal allowance, if it is necessary, it should be means tested. We should not give money to rich people who have coal stove for their convenience. And we know that we have about 1 million of households from the upper deciles of income distribution that are still heating their homes with coal stoves. So even if we need this, let's say, rescue, because the prices of coal are going up to extreme dimensions, then there is an easy solution. We can just make it means tested, and we can say, okay, we know that it's not very efficient. We know that this is, let's say, environmentally not very feasible. But as, let's say, last resource, we are saying, okay, we are helping people with low incomes to survive the winter, which is actually a policy that I would support, although I think that we need a coal phase out. But this is not what we have observed in the last year. And there are, I think, easy solutions, at least from the governmental side and from the regulation side, that could be implemented.
Thank you, Jakob. So this was an all-male panel, but it was high quality. So I have no regrets. And I thank you, Felix, Nils, Milan, Jakob, and Erik, of course, for opening this discussion. We will continue with further events, webinars on the labor market side of things, but also broader simulations at the EU level and for specific countries. So stay tuned. Thanks a lot for attending, for listening, and again, thanks for the interesting debate.